president in his final days reportedly angry about being compared to Richard Nixon, nearly alone in the White House, stripped of Twitter, with only aides to yell at. It's something fewer and fewer will have to bear as more staffers depart. Joining us now, someone who knows what some of that must be like, former White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci. Anthony, it's good to see you. Thank you. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances. So you heard President Trump described tonight as sullen, vengeful, lashing out at any comparison to the final days of Nixon. How do you see the next 6 days playing out?
Well, I think the very good news, and I think Director Comey said that, I think they've got most of this under control. You know, Delta Airlines not allowing guns on planes into D.C., Airbnb, et cetera. So if he could have one more big insurgency, he would. But I don't think he's going to be able to get that now because he doesn't have the communication, the direct messaging that was going on social media and stuff like that. So I think it's going to be sullen, anger-based, and somewhat solitary, Anderson. I don't see this thing mushrooming the way it could have if we didn't get under control in the last week.
Do you think he will go quietly? I mean, that his aides will be able to keep any remarks to something scripted on the teleprompter, that, you know, they've been able to do that the last couple of days?
Listen, you always get this wrong with President Trump. If you say he's going to go quietly, he'll act like a maniac on the way out, and then he might end up going quietly. I think lawyers, legitimate lawyers, are telling him that he's in a lot of trouble. You know, he incited a riot, he incited an insurrection. He's arguably, at least in the 21st century, you could say Timothy McVeigh for the 20th century, but he is the domestic terrorist of the 21st century in terms of the history of the 21st century. And so you tell me,
think he will be viewed as a domestic terrorist?
I think, right now we're all in shock about it because he's the president of the United States, and we always try to normalize that office. You and I, the rest of the world, still has an august opinion of the office of the presidency. And so you're reacting to it like, wow, we can't really have the president be a domestic terrorist. But 50 years from now, a presidential historian will look at the situation and say, my God, he didn't accept the election. He signaled prior to the election that he wasn't going to. And he incited an insurrection where people descended on the Capitol building calling for the death of his vice president. So you got to step back, Anderson, and look at it objectively and look at it from 2071, not 2021. And yes, I do think he will be known throughout history as somebody that incited domestic terrorism.
Do you think he will be held accountable, either in the Senate or afterward?
Well, again, I think Director Comey was spot on about the balancing test, but my personal view is that he has to be held accountable. He has to be convicted in the Senate. The guy really should go to jail. He's the president of the United States, so we're going to be cautious about that. But they've got to make this very punitive on him. As Speaker Pelosi said, there's nobody above the law. And so if you look at it prima facie, yes, something very damaging has to happen to him, which will send a signal to others. And oh, by the way, if you want unity in the United States, you have to stamp out the venality of Trumpism and the expression of Donald Trump in the last 2 weeks. You're not going to get unity unless you de-Trumpify an element of the country. And so, you just have to go to 1946 in Germany to understand that, Anderson. And so, yes, he's got to be punished. In my personal opinion, I'd love to see him in jail. That will likely not happen, but taking away the powers of an ex-president through the conviction, I think would be a good start.
But, it's so startling to me because there are a lot of good and decent people, millions of people who support the president, who believe his lies about the election. And I guess, to me, how does the country move forward with a new administration, and whether you're a Democrat or Republican or not, and we'll see how this new administration does, and we'll report aggressively on them. But how do you move forward if people in the country believe that the election itself was stolen? I mean, unless you have Trump, he's not going to be man enough to stand up and say, you know what, I lied. It was a big lie. It was a free and fair election. How does the country move forward?
Well, listen, I mean, you could look to history for how the country moves forward. I mean, in particular, I would go back to what Franklin Roosevelt said in 1940. He was running for an unprecedented third term. He had the America First movement that was really being sponsored by Charles Lindbergh at the time. And in a very great speech, you can find it on YouTube, he talked about creating aspirational opportunity for the average American. And so People don't agree with me on this, but I think that this is factual. Economic aspirational opportunity soothes anger, ends tribalism, and helps to knit the country back together. And that's why I applaud President-elect Biden in terms of the stimulus package that he's offering. We need to right-size some of these inequities that have been worsened by the pandemic. And I do think we can get to the other side of this with a very healing, optimistic message, but it has to be concomitant with this notion of economic aspiration. And so I'm optimistic about it. Remember, when he falls from power at 12:01 on January 20th, he's going to descend very quickly. And you've got 10 or so Republicans that look in the mirror every morning and see a future president. They'll do everything they can to put him lights out, Anderson. So there's a lot of forces working against him right now, both legal and political, that will be very good for the country.
I mean, I don't know why. I mean, I know why, some Republicans who are zealots and believers in Trumpism would want him to be hanging over the party for the next 4 years. But many Republicans obviously don't want that. This seems to be an actual opportunity, in fact, probably their only opportunity, to make it so that he will not be able to do that.
Yes, I agree with you. A student of history would recognize that this is the reckoning for Donald Trump, and this would call a healing and a possible reset for the party. But you have to remember, these guys are loaded with fear. They've got a lot of cowardice in that party. They're afraid to be primaried. They're afraid about the donor community. It looks like the corporate donors are fading now on the Republicans because of their actions. And they're looking for those small donors that were tribally tied to President Trump. They're hoping they can cling on to them. And so it's a very mixed up group of people. A visionary Republican would say, okay, enough of this nonsense. We have to restore our principles. We have to dial back the anger. We have to open up the tent and make it look more like the beautiful mosaic of the American people. Change the demographics, if you will, as well. But they don't have bold enough leadership standing up and delineating what they need to do to go forward. And so that's why many of these people are cowardly clutching to Trumpism still.
How much do you buy the argument that there's fear, not just the fear you spoke of, but also just frankly fear of Trump supporters, of Lindsey Graham being shouted down and Mitt Romney being shouted down on planes and airports by people who decide that it's a good idea to get in somebody's face for their political beliefs?
Well, listen, it's very unnerving, but just go back through the tapes of the president over the last 4.5 years. He gives license to that. He gives license to that anger. Every once in a while, a lawyer will get to him and he tones it down and he reads something off a teleprompter in a clumsy manner. But that's what he's done to these people. He's incited them. And it becomes very binary for these people. What I would say to those people, it's not America first. It's first, we are Americans. We have to stop the nonsense of America first and think of ourselves as Americans first, less tribal, less hyphenated, less state-related, more unified as a nation. And then maybe some of that stuff will get knocked off. Listen, I can tell you it's unnerving. I've gotten death threats. I've gotten people threatening my family, all of that sort of nonsense. I personally don't care because I grew up in a neighborhood. I know how to take it on. But there's a lot of representatives in the House of Representatives that are telling their friends they voted with the president because they fear these types of attacks and those types of death threats.
Anthony Scaramucci, I appreciate your time. Thank you.